Israel-Gaza war live updates. Ahead of possible visit, Biden says Israeli occupation of Gaza is big mistake. President Biden believes an Israeli occupation of Gaza would be a big mistake, saying in a 60 Minutes interview that aired Sunday night that Hamas doesn't represent every Palestinian. The White House is in talks with Israeli officials about Biden traveling to Israel, potentially as soon as this week, according to a person familiar with the discussions. The administration continues to support Israel, as seen by Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Monday return visit to Israel, while the country prepares to launch an invasion into Hamas-controlled Gaza by air, land and sea. Ahead of the anticipated invasion, hundreds of thousands of people in northern Gaza are fleeing in buses, in cars and on foot, crowding onto narrow roads leading south. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, a spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces, said Sunday that about 600,000 people had evacuated south and that others should follow. The Israeli military said it is preparing a wide range of offensive plans for the next stages of the war, with an emphasis on significant ground operations, though it has not provided a concrete indication of when the assault would start. Here's what to know. The Hamas attacks have killed at least 1,400 people in Israel and injured over 3,842, authorities said. Palestinian officials said 2,670 people in Gaza have been killed and 9,600 wounded. So far, 30 Americans have been killed in Israel and 13 U.S. nationals are unaccounted for, the State Department confirmed Sunday. Officials did not respond to questions asking whether any Americans have been killed in Gaza, where there are an estimated 500 to 600 Palestinian Americans. The U.S. Embassy in Israel said it will evacuate Americans and their immediate family members from Haifa, Israel, by sea to Cyprus on Monday. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is fast becoming untenable, UN Relief Head Martin Griffiths warned Saturday, adding that the worst is yet to come. The World Health Organization said Israel's directive to evacuate hospitals in northern Gaza was a death sentence for the sick and injured, and called on the country to reverse it. The Palestine Red Crescent Society has said it will continue to operate Al-Quds Hospital and Gaza's emergency medical center. U.S. officials signal pressure on Israel to address Gaza crisis. Cairo, Biden administration officials signaled Sunday that they were trying to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of an expected Israeli ground invasion of the Gaza Strip, even as the Palestinian death toll from airstrikes continued to rise and aid earmarked for the enclave remained stuck in Egypt. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, during an appearance on CNN's State of the Union, said people in Gaza deserved access to water and medicine and food. And we are working actively to ensure that happens, he said. Israel had agreed to turn on the water pipe, he said, but only to southern Gaza. President Biden, in an interview that aired Sunday on CBS's 60 Minutes, told interviewer Scott Pelley that he thought an Israeli occupation of Gaza would be a big mistake and sought to draw a distinction between Hamas and ordinary Palestinians. Hamas and the extreme elements of Hamas don't represent all the Palestinian people, Biden added, referring to the Palestinian militant group's surprise incursions into Israel last week, which killed 1,400 civilians and soldiers. And the State Department announced Sunday it had designated David Satterfield, a seasoned diplomat, as a special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues, with a mandate to facilitate the provision of life-saving assistance to the most vulnerable people and promote the safety of civilians. That emphasis represented a shift for the Biden administration, which has given blanket support to Israel's military operations in advance of a ground invasion that human rights groups say will result in large-scale civilian casualties. But there was little sign Sunday of any substantive steps toward easing the situation in Gaza, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israeli soldiers were ready to take action at any time in order to defeat the bloodthirsty monsters who have risen against us to destroy us. The Palestinian Health Ministry said Sunday that 8 days of Israeli strikes in Gaza had killed 2,670 people and wounded 9,600. Meanwhile, a siege has prevented food, fuel, electricity, and water from getting to the enclave's more than 2 million residents. An Israeli evacuation warning urging 1.1 million residents of northern Gaza to move south has exacerbated the crisis, aid workers said. Nearly 1 million people have been displaced in the space of a week, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees said Saturday. Gaza was running out of food and clean water, forcing people to use dirty water from wells, increasing risks of waterborne diseases, the agency warned. As Secretary of State Antony Blinken touched down in Egypt on Sunday, relief supplies sat at an airport in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, less than an hour's drive from the border with Gaza. Some of the aid supplies, delivered by regional countries such as Turkey, as well as the United Nations, have been stranded on Egypt's side of the border for days. Diplomats and others familiar with the discussions said one of the main obstacles to the delivery of that aid is the Israeli government's refusal to guarantee that it will not bomb relief trucks. One diplomatic official said negotiations were underway to allow Israel to inspect trucks entering Gaza. A spokesman for Netanyahu declined to comment. Humanitarian groups said they were desperate to see the aid start moving. "We are calling on all parties to open the humanitarian corridor, to have a humanitarian pause in the conflict and to open the border, to allow supplies to go into children who need them right now," Jeremy Hopkins, Egypt representative for UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Agency, said in an interview Sunday. Planeloads of aid from the United Nations had arrived on the Egyptian side of the border with Gaza, he said, and included drinking water, hygiene kits and portable toilets. "We don't know when it's coming. It needed to come 8 days ago," said Juliet Toma, a spokeswoman for UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. UNRWA staffers, who had relocated to southern Gaza, were rationing water, she said. 500,000 Palestinians were sheltering at the organization's facilities, under increasingly desperate conditions. Toma said her agency had not been able to confirm that water, or some water, had been restored. Gaza receives water through a variety of sources, aside from the public water network, including from private vendors. Desalination plants and pumping stations require fuel, which Israel was still blocking. "Nothing came into Gaza," she said. "Not a grain of wheat." Blinken, in an interview with Al Arabiya, also said that today, water was turned back on for Gaza. But much of Gaza's water comes from pumping stations and desalination plants, which cannot operate without electricity or fuel for generators. Other diplomats were less optimistic than the Biden administration that progress was being made on the humanitarian front. Gaza is running out of water, electricity, and other essential supplies even as aid stockpiled in Egypt, Jordan, the West Bank and Israel itself could be dispatched with hours, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said in a late afternoon statement. "We are on the verge of the abyss in the Middle East," he said, and neither the hostages being held by Hamas nor humanitarian aid to Gaza should become bargaining chips. On Sunday, a State Department spokesperson said that 30 U.S. citizens had been killed in the conflict, and another 13 remained missing. It remained unclear how many Americans were stuck in Gaza. Sullivan said on CBS's Face the Nation on Sunday that the U.S. government was working to assist Americans attempting to leave. The Biden administration, he said, was focusing on making sure that all American citizens in Gaza have safe passage out of Gaza and into Egypt. Biden has stood steadfastly by Israel since the Hamas attacks just over a week ago, even as Israel has launched a bombardment of airstrikes on Gaza that have killed more than 2,600 people. Israel also warned more than 1 million people in Gaza to evacuate in 24 hours, an order human rights groups have called impossible. Biden also said in the interview that Hamas needs to be eliminated entirely but that there needs to be a path to a Palestinian state. But the president said he did not think Israel would pursue that path right now. "But I think Israel understands that a significant portion of Palestinian people do not share the views of Hamas and Hezbollah," Biden said. Tensions continue to rise between Israel and Hamas. The armed wing of the Palestinian group said Sunday that it had bombed the town of Sderot in southern Israel, calling it retaliation for Israel's bombing of civilians. According to local news reports, the bombing occurred as Israeli authorities evacuated Sderot, a city of about 30,000 people near the Gaza Strip that was one of the first places Hamas militants targeted in their attack on Israel last weekend. Sderot Deputy Mayor Elad Kalimi told the Times of Israel on Sunday that an estimated two-thirds of the city's population had already evacuated. Israel's armed forces fired shells towards southern Lebanon early Sunday, after reports of a strike launched from within Lebanon against the northern Israeli town of Shtola. The two sides exchanged fire several times throughout the day. The Magen David Adom Ambulance Service of Israel said one person was killed and 3 people were injured in the strike on Shdola, the Times of Israel reported. Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group, said it conducted the strike with guided missiles in response to Israeli attacks, including the shelling that killed a Reuters videographer and injured 6 other journalists in southern Lebanon on Friday. In a statement, the Israeli military said one of its posts on the Lebanese border also came under fire. It said it shut access to an area up to 4 kilometers from the northern border with Lebanon on Sunday morning in response to an incident in northern Israel. It asked residents not to enter or approach the area and warned that GPS signals would be restricted. Fahim reported from Beirut and De Young from Washington. Annabelle Timsit in London, Sarah Dadouch in Beirut, Kevin Seif in Mexico City, Steve Hendricks in Jerusalem and Yasmin Abudaleb in Washington contributed to this report. How the Israel-Gaza conflict is unfolding in maps, graphics, and videos. It has been more than a week since Hamas militants crossed into Israel on a murderous rampage, killing more than 1,300 people and taking hostages, the start of a bloody and unpredictable new chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli military has responded by pummeling the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip with airstrikes, killing more than 2,600 Palestinians, and massing troops along the border in preparation for a ground offensive. Israel called upon 1.1 million Palestinians who live in northern Gaza to leave the area, a directive that the United Nations said was not feasible and could transform what is already a tragedy into a calamitous situation. The week has brought fear, destruction and uncertainty for millions in the region. Here's how the events unfolded. NLT, BNGT, Day 1 NLT/BNGT, Saturday, October 7th. Day of the attack. Early Saturday morning, under the cover of thousands of rockets, Hamas militants breached Israel's high-tech smart wall and went on a killing rampage in small towns across southern Israel. The ambush took Israeli forces by surprise. Officials said the attackers overran more than 20 communities. It took the military 10 hours to arrive in some towns. By that point, hundreds of civilians were already dead. Militants are believed to have taken more than 100 hostages into Gaza. NLT, BNGT, Day 2 NLT/BNGT, Sunday, October 8th. Fighting continues, death toll rises. Fighting continued with militant holdouts inside Israel as the country formally declared war on Hamas. Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group that is allied with Hamas, fired dozens of rockets into northern Israel. The Israel Defense Forces launched a punishing campaign of airstrikes on Gaza, displacing thousands of people in the first 24 hours. In Israel, the death toll continued to rise. More than 250 bodies were recovered at the site of a trance music festival held just 3 miles away from the Gaza border. Survivors described tired festivalgoers running for their lives in a wide-open field as militants gunned them down. NLT, BNGT, Day 3 NLT/BNGT, Monday, October 9th. A complete siege of Gaza. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordered a complete siege of Gaza, saying Israel would cut off supplies of power, food and gas. Gazans have lived for 16 years under an Israeli blockade supported by Egypt and are heavily dependent on Israel for electricity and other basic services. Cutting off gas and power could leave many residents not only without electricity, but also without clean drinking water, proper sanitation and health care. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk would a day later condemn the siege, saying that depriving civilians of goods essential for their survival is prohibited under international humanitarian law. As airstrikes on Gaza continued, fleeing Palestinians saw their last hope erased. Strikes near the Rafah crossing with Egypt, the last route out of the territory, closed the checkpoint indefinitely, leaving civilians with nowhere to go. NLT, BNGT, Day 4 NLT/BNGT, Tuesday, October 10th. Scenes of more destruction. Bodies in Israel were still being found. After 2.5 days of intense fighting in Kfar Aza, one of the first towns attacked, soldiers escorted journalists through scenes of utter ruin. Homes were burned, cars were smashed, and the air smelled of death. Israeli commanders said they had gained control of the border around Gaza, but Hamas continued to fire rockets into Israel, even as IDF airstrikes targeted militant infrastructure and command posts. The military said it had carried out more than 2,000 strikes across Gaza since Saturday, killing hundreds of Palestinians. Israel pledged to focus its fire on Hamas fighters and abide by international law. 2 members of Hamas's political office were killed. But mosques, hospitals, residential buildings, and international aid groups were also hit. NLT, BNGT, Day 4 NLT/BNGT, Wednesday, October 11th. Gaza loses power. Israeli strikes on Gaza intensified, many concentrated in heavily populated areas in the north. The death toll surpassed 1,100 people, and more than 263,000 people were displaced across the Strip. The United Nations announced 11 workers were killed. Palestinian authorities said Gaza's only power plant had run out of fuel and was no longer operating. Israel provides Gaza with power in 2 ways. Gaza's power plant runs on imported diesel fuel. There are also 10 direct power lines from Israel to Gaza. Now, both sources were cut off. NLT, BNGT, Day 5 NLT/BNGT, Thursday, October 12. Preparing for a ground assault. Israeli tanks deployed to the border with Gaza, and reservists arrived for duty at the Julis military base near Ashkelon. Meanwhile, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza continued. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, a spokesman for the IDF, said in a televised briefing that Israel would no longer allow Hamas to exist next door. Unlike other operations, we are collapsing the governance and sovereignty of the Hamas organization, he said. Deep underground, in the northern Israeli city of Haifa, medics lined up hospital beds and braced for the possibility of a wider regional escalation. After rocket fire from Syria earlier in the week, Israel launched missile strikes on 2 of the nation's main airports, authorities in Damascus said. NLT, BNGT, Day 6 NLT/BNGT, Friday, October 13. Israel calls for evacuations. Israel told the 1.1 million people living in northern Gaza to move south within 24 hours, a warning the United Nations called impossible without devastating humanitarian consequences. Included in the directive was Gaza City, the Strip's most densely populated area. The call came as Israel continued to pummel the Strip with bombs and the death toll surged past 1,500. The United Nations said an estimated 600,000 people are displaced to the southern half of Gaza, though this number is likely an undercount. With exits to Israel and Egypt closed, Gazans have nowhere to go. A mass evacuation could transform what is already a tragedy into a calamitous situation, the United Nations said. NLT, BNGT, Day 7 NLT/BNGT, Saturday, October 14. Gaza residents flee south. The main roads running north to south were crowded for a second day Saturday after the Israeli military called for civilians to move south of the Wadi Gaza wetlands through designated streets. Many fled on foot. But some civilians refused to leave northern Gaza, fearing that escape routes are too dangerous. Hamas's media office said airstrikes hit cars as they headed south from Gaza City, killing 70 people. NLT, BNGT, Day 8 NLT/BNGT, Sunday, October 15. Troops spotted near the border. As a ground invasion looms, Israeli troops and armored vehicles were seen in multiple locations near the northern and eastern borders with Gaza on Saturday and Sunday. Several vehicles amassed in the southern Israeli city of Ashkelon. Tanks were also spotted in Nahal Oz, an Israeli town near Gaza City. Israel vows to destroy Hamas. What happens to Gaza at the war's end? Jerusalem, as Israel bombards Gaza and its forces coil for the start of a major war, many here are already asking, what lies at the end? The uneasy coexistence that Israel and Hamas have honed over 17 years, cycles of bloody escalation followed by periods of economic peace, in which Gazans could work in and export goods to Israel, is unlikely to survive the coming conflagration, experts said. The images of Hamas infiltrators slaughtering Israeli families and kidnapping children ended that status quo. What will replace it is still impossible to predict. We haven't seen this before, said Chuck Freilich, a former Israeli deputy national security advisor. This is not just another round with Hamas. The shape of the next Israel-Gaza relationship may depend, among other factors, on what's left of Hamas and Gaza, when the fighting stops. Already, Israel's air attacks have killed more than 2,600, according to Palestinian authorities, and begun to decimate public infrastructure. As the shock wave from a Hamas rampage that killed 1,400 Israelis has swept away old assumptions, scenarios that seemed impossible just days ago could be in play: Israel reoccupying Gaza, at least temporarily, the return of the Palestinian Authority to the enclave, international peacekeepers, a demilitarized Hamas still technically holding government authority. Israeli officials are not ready to publicly discuss the possibilities. "We need to see how long it will take to destroy Hamas. And then I believe there will be an international understanding with Israel for the day after," Intelligence Minister Gila Gamliel said in an interview. "But now we need to put all our power into winning this war." Israel's stated objective for the looming battle is to eliminate Hamas, which is designated as a terrorist group by the United States and others, once and for all. "We will crush and destroy it," Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledged to Israelis in a televised address Wednesday. The Israeli public is widely and furiously behind that goal, for now. "Destroy Gaza," reads a banner hanging over a highway in the left-leaning city of Tel Aviv. But past wars suggest the mood could shift, and international support could wane, if the expected ground war drags on and produces horrifying body counts. Israel's military is more circumspect than its leading politicians have been. The Israel Defense Forces said they are gathering tanks and troops, one of the largest mobilizations in the country's history, with an operational goal of defeating Hamas and eliminating all senior officials involved. This would amount to a greatly expanded version of previous war aims, in which the IDF pulled out once it completed a target list meant to degrade Hamas's military capabilities. A scenario in which the political wing of Hamas survives to govern the enclave is highly unlikely but not impossible, according to Yossi Melman, a longtime intelligence columnist for the newspaper Haaretz. Officials entertain the possibility mainly because it would support a strategic priority of Netanyahu's, continuing the split of the Palestinian people between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, which governs the West Bank. "This has always been a dream scenario for Israel, a disarmed Hamas that remains in power," Melman said. "Even if Israel does kill every Hamas leader in Gaza and collapse every tunnel, destroying the organization may not be possible," experts said. Hamas has leaders who are exiled but active and known to move around between Beirut, Istanbul, and Doha, Qatar. And Hamas supporters can be found not just in Gaza but also throughout the West Bank and elsewhere. "What does it mean to crush Hamas?" Melman asked. "Hamas is an ideology, like the Islamic State. It's difficult to crush an idea. The vacuum that would follow a deposed Hamas would need to be filled by some governing body that could rebuild the devastated enclave while preventing Hamas from regenerating itself. But who? Israel dismantled Jewish settlements and pulled its permanent military presence out of Gaza in 2005. It last kept any military forces inside the enclave in 2014, during part of a 7-week war that left more than 2,300 Gazans and 73 Israelis dead. While security analysts said it was easy to imagine that this war would last even longer, the possibility that Israel might return to Gaza full-time is widely seen as a non-starter here. "Israel is not willing to sacrifice any more of its soldiers' lives than is necessary," said Kobi Michael, a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. "After what could be a brutal invasion, staying in Gaza to govern will have no appeal. Israel is not going to occupy Gaza and run the lives of 2 million Palestinians," Michael said. "An international or Arab peacekeeping force is one option," Michael said. "Another is the eventual return of the Palestinian Authority, which was the governing body of the Gaza Strip between 1994 and 2006, when Hamas won a restoration of the authority, which is already viewed by many Palestinians as a corrupt agent of Israeli security agencies, would need to be carefully managed," he said. "Its legitimacy would take another blow if Israel is seen as simply ushering in Palestinian Authority security forces when the IDF is ready to leave. It will be perceived that they were carried in on the bayonet of the Israeli army," Melman said. Some analysts said the recent thaw in Israel's relations with Arab states could provide a way. Before the Hamas attack, Saudi Arabia was talking to the Biden administration about establishing ties with Israel. It's possible that Riyadh could play a role in brokering the Palestinian Authority's arrival in Gaza City. The Saudis had been signaling that any bilateral deal with Israel needed to include provisions for the Palestinians, probably including measures to bolster the diminishing Palestinian Authority, Freilich noted. Maybe this could be it, he said. But the willingness of Persian Gulf states, and other governments, to help Israel craft an endgame may depend on how the Gaza war concludes. The world was shocked by Hamas's brutality, but experience shows that civilian casualties and humanitarian agony in Gaza will erode public support. Now we see strong support from the US and Western countries, Freilich said. But public support will shift, weaken, as the Gaza campaign gets ugly. Netanyahu's standing, too, will be a factor. Anger is boiling at the Prime Minister both for failing to prevent the massacre and for the strategy that empowered Hamas as a rival to the Palestinian Authority. Prime Minister Golda Meir stepped down soon after the outbreak of the 1973 Yom Kippur War surprised Israel, and Netanyahu can expect a similar reckoning, said Solon Solomon, a former Knesset lawyer and an international law professor at Brunel University London. It is almost certain that once the ground operation is over, after some months, Prime Minister Netanyahu will stop serving as Prime Minister, he said.